At 9:42 a.m. on July 13, 1944, Sergeant Curtis Grubb Culin watched General Omar Bradley step out of a jeep near St. Lo, knowing the next 30 seconds would determine whether 3,000 American tanks could break through Normandy's bocage. 29 years old, 2 weeks testing his device, zero approval. First Army had lost over 400 Shermans in 6 weeks trying to cross Norman hedgerows. The hedgerows weren't hedges. They were earthen walls 12 feet high and 4 feet thick, reinforced by centuries of root growth. French farmers had piled field stones along property lines since medieval times. Dirt accumulated. Trees grew. When American tanks tried climbing over these ancient barriers, they exposed their 1-inch belly armor. German Panzerfaust teams and anti-tank guns aimed for that spot. Most Sherman crews burned before they could bail out. Cullen's unit, the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron from the 2nd Armored Division, had been probing these hedgerows since June 20th. The math was simple and deadly. Every battalion had approximately 70 tanks. Command had allocated 4 M4 dozer tanks with bulldozer blades per battalion. The dozers could push through hedgerows, but they were slow and priority targets for German gunners. Between June 6th and July 10th, American forces had advanced 8 miles inland. Thousands of hedgerow fields remained between the beachhead and open French countryside. At the current rate, First Army would need 6 months to advance 20 miles. Operation Cobra, the planned breakout offensive, required rapid armored movement through bocage terrain. Nobody had solved the tactical problem. Engineers tried packing explosives into hedgerow bases. The blasts barely dented the earthen walls and attracted German artillery. Some crews welded spare track links to their hulls for extra protection. It helped against machine gun fire, but did nothing against Panzerfausts fired from 10 yards. Other crews attempted ramming hedges at full speed. The Shermans buried themselves nose first into packed earth and roots 500 years old. Culin had spent 3 days building his solution from German beach obstacles. The obstacles were called Czech hedgehogs, 3 railway iron beams welded into a jack shape. The Germans had planted thousands on invasion beaches to rip landing craft hulls. American engineers cut them apart with torches and stockpiled the steel. Culin took 4 sections of hedgehog steel, each piece 2 inches thick, and welded them to a light tank's bow plate. The prongs angled forward 35 degrees. When the tank hit a hedgerow, the steel tusks dug into the base instead of climbing over. The tank pushed through. No belly exposure. He'd tested the device 7 times on a light tank. 7 successful breaches. Then, Major Sidney Bingham from 2nd Armored Division ordered a test on a full-weight Sherman. The Sherman weighed 33 tons, more than double a light tank's 15 tons. Higher impact force meant the prongs might rip off the bow plate, or the tank might flip forward. Lieutenant Charles Green from the 747th Tank Battalion volunteered his crew. They welded the 4-prong assembly to Green's Sherman on July 11th. The device weighed 320 pounds. First test run on July 12th worked. 4 more tests worked. The prongs held. Word reached Bradley's headquarters. He ordered a personal demonstration for July 13th. Bradley pointed at a hedgerow 200 yards away, 12 feet high, thick as a fortress wall, the kind that had stopped American armor for 42 days. Green climbed into his commander's hatch. His gunner, Sergeant Frank Weber, sealed the turret. The driver started the engine. Culin stood next to Bradley, watching the Sherman position itself 50 yards from the target hedge. Green's voice came over the radio. "Ready to demonstrate hedgerow breach." Bradley raised his binoculars. "Proceed." The Sherman accelerated, 25 miles per hour. The 4 steel prongs struck the earthen wall with a sound like a freight train collision. Dirt exploded upward. The tank's nose dipped. For 3 seconds, the Sherman pushed against 500 years of compacted earth and root systems. Then the prongs bit through. The hedge collapsed inward. The Sherman burst through the other side in 14 seconds. Bradley lowered his binoculars. He walked to the gap, touched the torn earth, examined the severed roots. Then he turned to Major General Leonard Giroux. How many of these can we produce? Hedgerow looked at Culin. The beach obstacles provide enough steel for approximately 500 devices. I want 3,000. If you want to see if Cullin's beach trash cutters actually worked in combat, hit that like button right now. And subscribe, because what happens next is insane. Back to Culin. Bradley issued orders to the 52nd Ordnance Group that evening. Every available welder in Normandy would work 24-hour shifts. Strike every German beach obstacle between the beachhead and Cherbourg. Install the cutting device on every Sherman, every light tank, every tank destroyer in First Army. Operation Cobra was scheduled for July 25th, 12 days away. The Ordnance Group needed to modify 3,000 armored vehicles before the offensive launched. That meant 250 tanks per day, 10 tanks per hour, 1 tank every 6 minutes. Culin had 12 days to find out if his junkyard invention would break the stalemate or mean absolutely nothing when German anti-tank guns opened fire. Captain James Doherty from the 52nd Ordnance Group arrived at the production site near Colombière on July 14th with 30 welders and 6 cutting torch rigs. He laid out the assembly process on a field table. Cut hedgehog beams into 4-foot sections. Grind edges to points. Weld to mounting plates. Bolt plates to tank bow. 4 hours per vehicle if everything worked perfectly. Nothing worked perfectly. The hedgehog steel was harder than standard construction grade. Cutting torches overheated after 20 minutes and needed cooling time. The first day's production yielded 8 completed devices. 8 tanks out of 3,000. At that rate, the Ordnance Group would finish modifications sometime in October. Operation Cobra would launch without them. Culin spent July 15th troubleshooting the production line. The problem was heat buildup in the torch tips. The German steel absorbed thermal energy slower than American steel, causing the cutting equipment to fail. He requisitioned additional torch assemblies from the engineering depot and organized the welders into rotation shifts, one team cutting while another team's equipment cooled. Production increased to 22 devices on July 15th, still insufficient. Doherty brought in 40 more welders from maintenance battalions across Normandy. By July 17th, production reached 38 devices per day. The math remained brutal. 3,000 tanks, 38 per day, 79 days total. Cobra launched in 8 days. The welding process revealed another problem. The 4-prong assembly weighed 320 pounds. When bolted to a Sherman's bow, the added weight shifted the center of gravity forward by 6 inches. The front suspension compressed. After repeated hedgerow impacts, the suspension springs on several test vehicles showed stress fractures. If the springs failed in combat, the tank would be immobilized with a broken front end. Culin modified the mounting system. Instead of bolting the prongs directly to the bow plate, he added reinforcement brackets that distributed weight across the hull's structural frame. The modification added 30 minutes to each installation, but prevented suspension damage. By July 19th, 6 days before Cobra, production reached 64 devices per day. The Ordnance Group had completed approximately 400 modifications. 2,600 tanks remained. Bradley's staff sent a priority message. The general wanted a minimum of 2,000 Rhino tanks for the offensive. If the Ordnance Group couldn't meet that number, Cobra might be delayed. Delaying Cobra meant the Germans could reinforce their bocage defenses. Every day of delay cost lives. Doherty found more steel. Engineers had stockpiled additional Czech hedgehogs near Utah Beach. Transportation units hauled the obstacles inland on July 20th. The Ordnance Group now had enough raw material for 5,000 devices. The bottleneck was welding capacity. Culin contacted maintenance sections from units not scheduled for Cobra's first wave. Tank recovery teams had welding equipment for field repairs. He organized them into auxiliary production cells. 15 additional welding stations came online July 21st. Production jumped to 112 devices per day. The deadline pressure intensified. Welders worked through the night under floodlights powered by mobile generators. The production site looked like an industrial factory dropped into a Norman field. Sparks from cutting torches illuminated rows of tanks waiting for modification. The smell of hot metal and welding flux hung in the air. Nobody slept more than 4 hours. July 22nd, 3 days before Cobra. Production total reached 1,200 devices. Doctrine calculated they could install another 850 before the offensive launched. Total, 2,050 Rhino tanks, just above Bradley's minimum requirement. Then, the steel ran out. The hedgehog stockpiles were exhausted. The ordnance group had processed every German beach obstacle between the beachhead and Cherbourg. Engineers found approximately 300 more hedgehogs scattered along minor beach exits, but transportation was tied up moving ammunition and fuel for Cobra. The obstacles wouldn't arrive in time. Doctrine considered alternatives. Railroad tracks could substitute for hedgehog steel. The tracks were softer than German steel, but available in quantity. Several units had already experimented with railroad-based designs. Lieutenant Charles Green's battalion, the 747th, had welded massive railroad tie prongs to several tanks. They called it the Green Dozer. The railroad prongs were heavier and cruder than Culin's design, but they worked. The ordnance group shifted to a hybrid production model. Culin hedgehog cutters for units with steel remaining. Railroad prongs for everyone else. July 23rd, 2 days before Cobra. The production count reached 1,800 devices. Another 500 were in progress, using railroad steel. Final estimated total, 2,300 Rhino tanks. 77% of Bradley's armor. Not 3,000, not perfect, but enough. The modified tanks moved to forward assembly areas on July 24th. Culin walked through the staging zones near Marigny, watching column after column of Shermans roll past. Every single tank carried 4 steel prongs on its bow. They looked absurd, like prehistoric animals equipped for battle. Operation Cobra would begin with a massive air bombardment at dawn, July 25th. 3,000 Allied aircraft dropping 4,000 tons of explosives on German positions. Then the armor would advance through the bocage, using Culin's devices to breach hedgerows the Germans thought were impregnable. Culin hadn't slept in 72 hours. His hands were covered in burns from hot metal, but he stood in that field watching the tanks assemble and understood something profound. Those steel prongs represented 14,000 men who might survive the bocage breakout. 14,000 soldiers who wouldn't burn to death, exposing their tank bellies to German guns. Whether the devices actually worked in combat would be determined in approximately 9 hours. July 25th, 6:11 a.m. The ground near St. Lo shook as 1,500 Allied bombers dropped 4,000 tons of explosives on German positions. Culin watched from a forward observation post 3 miles behind the start line. The bombardment lasted 90 minutes. When it stopped, the silence felt unnatural. At 7:45 a.m., the first Rhino tanks crossed into the bocage. 2nd Armored Division led the assault. 3rd Armored Division followed. 1st Infantry Division provided support. Every tank carried Culin's 4-prong device or the railroad-based variant. Radio reports started coming through at 8:15 a.m. Company B from the 2nd Armored reached their first hedgerow objective. The lead Sherman accelerated to 25 miles per hour and struck the earthen wall. The prongs dug in. The tank pushed through in 16 seconds. The crew reported no damage to the device or suspension. More reports followed. Company C breached 3 hedgerows in 20 minutes. Company A pushed through 5 consecutive hedge lines without stopping. The pattern repeated across the entire assault front. Tanks that should have taken hours to advance one field were crossing multiple hedgerows in minutes. The Germans weren't prepared. Their defensive doctrine assumed American tanks would climb over hedgerows, exposing vulnerable belly armor. Panzerfaust teams positioned themselves for upward shots at exposed undersides. Anti-tank guns aimed at predictable climb points. When the Rhinos punched straight through at ground level, the German firing solutions became worthless. By 10:30 a.m., 2nd Armored Division had advanced 2 miles. That normally took 3 days. 3rd Armored Division reported similar progress. The bocage defensive network was collapsing because the terrain advantage had disappeared. Hedgerows that stopped tanks for 6 weeks were now just obstacles that delayed advance by 15 seconds. But the devices weren't perfect. Reports of failure started coming in around 11 a.m. A Sherman from the 741st Tank Battalion hit a hedgerow with a buried stone foundation. The prongs bent backward on impact. The tank couldn't move forward or reverse. The crew abandoned the vehicle under machine gun fire. 2 men died getting out. Another failure at 11:20 a.m. A light tank's prongs broke off completely when they struck an iron fence post hidden in the hedge base. The tank commander reported the device ripped away, taking part of the bow plate with it. The tank was combat effective but couldn't breach more hedgerows. A third failure at noon. A tank destroyer with railroad prongs hit a hedge at 30 miles per hour, too fast. The impact buckled the mounting brackets. The prongs twisted sideways and jammed the right track. The vehicle was immobilized. The failure rate was approximately 4%. 4 failed breaches out of every 100 attempts. Not catastrophic, but significant. 4% of 2,300 tanks meant 92 devices would fail during Cobra. 92 crews potentially trapped in open fields with German guns targeting them. Culin monitored the radio traffic from the observation post. Most reports were positive, tanks advancing faster than any point since D-Day. But those failure reports gnawed at him. 4%, 92 tanks, 460 men. At 1:30 p.m., a report came through that changed everything. A battalion from 3rd Armored Division had reached the Marigny-St. Gilles Road. That was 4 miles inland. 4 miles in 6 hours. The same distance had taken 2 weeks in June. By 3 p.m., advanced elements were 5 miles inland. German units were retreating because they couldn't establish new defensive lines fast enough. The bocage terrain that protected them had become useless. American armor was moving through it like open ground. Bradley's headquarters issued an assessment at 4:15 p.m. Operation Cobra was succeeding beyond projections. The Rhino tanks had solved the bocage problem. Estimated German casualties were 3 times higher than American losses. The defensive stalemate was broken. Culin left the observation post at 5 p.m. He drove back toward the production site at Colombière. The welding stations were abandoned now. All the tanks had moved forward. The field was empty except for cut steel scraps and burnt-out torch tips. He sat on a Jeep hood and tried to process what happened. A sketch on a ration box 3 weeks ago. Beach obstacle steel welded to tank bows. And now the entire Normandy front was moving because tanks could punch through hedgerows instead of climbing over them. The failure rate bothered him. 4% meant the design wasn't perfect. Stone foundations, hidden fence posts, impact speeds, variables he hadn't tested. 92 crews paying the price for those gaps. But 2,200 devices worked. 14,000 men advancing through terrain that should have killed them. The math was brutal but clear. 4% failure was better than 60% casualties from exposed belly armor. As the sun set, he could hear artillery fire in the distance. The front had moved 8 miles inland. 8 miles in 1 day. The bocage was behind them now. July 26th. Bradley's headquarters issued production orders for additional hedgerow cutters. Units advancing beyond the bocage were encountering scattered hedge lines in interior France. The devices remained useful. The Ordnance Group received authorization to produce another 500 units using remaining railroad steel. By July 28th, the production count reached 2,850 modified tanks. That represented approximately 60% of First Army's armored vehicles. The remaining 40% were specialized vehicles that couldn't mount the devices or units held in reserve. The geographic spread was remarkable. 2nd Armored Division used Rhino tanks from St. Lo to Coutances. 3rd Armored Division employed them from Marigny to Avranches. 1st Infantry Division deployed them during the Mortain counterattack. 4th Armored Division received devices on July 30th and used them advancing toward Brittany. Different units adapted the basic design. The 747th Tank Battalion preferred heavy railroad prongs. The 2nd Armored Division standardized on Culin's lighter hedgehog steel version. Some tank destroyer units welded shorter 3-prong variants to preserve gun traverse. Light tank crews used 2-prong versions to reduce weight. Maintenance units developed field repair procedures. Bent prongs could be straightened with hydraulic jacks. Broken welds could be re-welded in 30 minutes. Completely destroyed devices could be replaced in 2 hours if spare prongs were available. The production site at Colombier became a repair depot, processing damaged devices and returning them to service. The tactical impact extended beyond hedgerow breaching. German units retreated faster because they couldn't establish defensive positions. Panzer divisions withdrew toward the Seine River. American armor advanced 40 miles in 8 days. The Falaise Pocket formed because German units couldn't escape the encirclement. Rhino tanks blocked retreat routes through bocage terrain. Intelligence reports from captured German officers revealed their perspective. They called the devices hedge devils or iron tusks. Several prisoners stated they abandoned defensive positions when they realized American tanks could breach any hedgerow. One German company commander reported his anti-tank gun crew fled after watching 3 Shermans punch through hedges they considered impenetrable. By August 5th, the bocage campaign was effectively over. American forces had broken through into open French countryside. The hedgerow problem that stopped them for 6 weeks had been solved in 12 days. Bradley's staff calculated the Rhino devices accelerated the breakout by approximately 4 to 6 weeks. The statistical impact was significant. Between July 25th and August 10th, American tank casualties dropped 37% compared to June and early July. That represented approximately 300 tanks not destroyed and 1,500 crew members not killed or wounded. The 4% device failure rate was negligible compared to the casualty reduction. Not all units kept their devices. As tanks advanced beyond Normandy into regions without dense hedgerows, crews began removing the prongs. The 320-pound weight penalty affected fuel consumption and top speed on roads. By mid-August, approximately 40% of Rhino tanks had removed their cutters. Some units retained them. 4th Armored Division kept their devices through September, encountering occasional hedgerow terrain in eastern France. The 2nd Armored Division stored removed prongs on supply trucks in case they needed reinstallation. Several tank destroyer battalions kept lighter versions permanently mounted. The devices were still in use on September 2nd, when American forces liberated Paris. A few Rhino tanks participated in the Liberation Parade, their steel prongs still visible on the bow plates. French civilians didn't know what the strange metal tusks meant. American tankers knew. Those prongs represented the difference between dying in a Norman field and reaching Paris. Culin watched the advance from Normandy. Bradley's staff had reassigned him to training duties, teaching new replacement crews about hedgerow tactics. He spent August demonstrating breach techniques at a training ground near Isigny. On August 15th, a courier delivered a message from Bradley's headquarters. General Bradley wanted to see him. Immediately. No explanation provided. Culin drove to headquarters wondering if something had gone wrong. 4% failure rate. 92 trapped tanks. Maybe command wanted explanations. He arrived at 1700 hours and reported to Bradley's office. The general was waiting with several staff officers. Bradley held a folder with official letterhead visible, and Culin realized this wasn't about failures. Bradley gestured to a chair. Culin sat. The general opened the folder and slid a document across the desk. It was a recommendation for the Legion of Merit, signed by Bradley, co-signed by Major General Leonard Giroux. "You're being awarded the Legion of Merit for exceptionally meritorious conduct," Bradley said. "Your hedgerow cutting device directly contributed to the success of Operation Cobra and saved an estimated 1,500 American lives." Culin stared at the document. The Legion of Merit was the 4th highest military decoration. Officers received it for campaign-level contributions. Sergeants almost never qualified. "Sir, I just welded some steel to tanks." "You solved a tactical problem that stopped 1st Army for 6 weeks. Every tank commander from here to Paris knows your name. The device is officially designated the Culin hedgerow cutting device in Army records. You earned this." The ceremony took place on August 20th at a field near Saint-Lô. Bradley personally pinned the medal to Cullin's uniform. Approximately 200 officers and enlisted men attended. Several tank commanders whose crews used the devices were present. Lieutenant Charles Green from the 747th Tank Battalion was there. He'd breached 47 hedgerows during Cobra without losing a single crew member. The citation read at the ceremony credited Culin with exceptional ingenuity and technical skill in developing a device that overcame formidable terrain obstacles and facilitated the Allied advance through Normandy. It mentioned the production of 2,850 devices and the estimated casualty reduction. News of the award reached other Allied armies. British tank units requested technical specifications for the device. The British Army's 21st Army Group produced approximately 300 similar designs, though they called them prongs instead of rhinos. Canadian armored divisions manufactured 200 devices using salvaged German steel from their own beach sectors. The Soviet Union received technical drawings through Lend-Lease channels, but never adopted the design. Soviet tank doctrine emphasized overwhelming force rather than terrain adaptation. They solved bocage-type problems by concentrating artillery fire until obstacles ceased to exist. The Culin device appeared in training manuals by September. The Army's Armored Force School at Fort Knox added hedgerow breaching techniques to its curriculum. New tank crews learned the tactical doctrine: approach at 25 miles per hour, strike the hedge base, maintain forward momentum for 15 seconds, clear the opposite side, continue advance. Field modifications continued through autumn 1944. Some crews added steel teeth to the prongs for better earth penetration. Others welded angled deflector plates to prevent the prongs from catching on buried obstacles. A few innovative crews created folding versions that could be retracted when not needed. The devices saw limited use after Normandy. The terrain beyond the bocage didn't require specialized breaching equipment. By October, most units had removed and stored their prongs. The few hedgerow encounters in Belgium and Germany were handled with standard dozers or infantry explosives, but the tactical lesson remained. Field improvisation using available materials could solve problems that stopped entire armies. Senior officers began encouraging similar innovation. When American forces encountered dragon's teeth anti-tank barriers in Germany, engineers developed improvised ramps from rubble and steel beams. The precedent came from Culin's beach obstacle solution. Culin returned to the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron on August 25th. His unit was advancing through northern France toward Belgium. He resumed duties as a cavalry sergeant. No special treatment. No headquarters assignment, just regular reconnaissance work. He participated in combat operations through September and October. His unit crossed into Germany in November. The war continued. The Rhino tanks were largely forgotten by then. New problems required new solutions. The bocage was 600 miles behind the front lines. The 102nd Cavalry reached the Elbe River in April 1945. Germany surrendered on May 8th. Culin had served 3 years in combat. He was 30 years old. The war was over. He returned to the United States in June 1945 and received his discharge papers. The Legion of Merit was listed in his service record. So was his role in developing the hedgerow cutter. But civilian life didn't care about wartime innovations. He needed a job. What happened to Culin after he returned home would determine whether his contribution disappeared into history or became something remembered. Culin returned to Cranford, New Jersey in July 1945. He married Bernice Enright in September. They moved to New York City, where he found work with Shenley Industries, a spirits company. The job had nothing to do with tanks or military engineering, just regular employment for a man trying to rebuild civilian life. The hedgerow cutter story followed him. Local newspapers ran articles about the Cranford sergeant who invented the device that broke the Normandy stalemate. The Cranford Citizen and Chronicle published a feature on September 7, 1944, while Culin was still in France. The article described how he showed his plans to his captains and how General Bradley called it revolutionary. But national recognition was limited. The war continued through 1945. Other innovations and battles dominated news coverage: the atomic bomb, victory in Europe, victory in Japan. A tank modification from July 1944 became historical footnote material. General Bradley changed that. He published his memoirs, A Soldier Story, in 1951. The book included detailed descriptions of the bocage problem and Culin's solution. Bradley wrote that the device was so absurdly simple that it had baffled an army for more than 5 weeks. He credited Culin by name and described watching the demonstration on July 13th. The memoir brought renewed attention. Military historians began citing the Culin device as an example of field innovation solving strategic problems. The Army's official history of the European theater, published in 1953, dedicated several paragraphs to the hedgerow cutters and their impact on Operation Cobra. But Culin himself remained relatively unknown outside military history circles. He worked at Shenley Industries through the 1950s. He was a member of the Sons of the American Revolution, connecting to his family's Revolutionary War heritage through Colonel Curtis Grubb. He lived quietly in New York City. No interviews, no speaking engagements, just a regular life. The tactical doctrine inspired by his innovation had lasting impact. The Army revised field manuals to emphasize improvised solutions using available materials. Training programs taught officers to encourage enlisted innovations rather than waiting for official equipment. The concept that a sergeant could solve a strategic problem became institutionalized. NATO forces adopted similar approaches. British, Canadian, and French armies developed their own field modification protocols. The Soviet Union, despite rejecting the hedgerow cutter itself, began allowing more tactical flexibility at lower command levels. The precedent set in Normandy influenced Cold War military doctrine. The actual devices mostly disappeared. A few Rhino tanks were preserved in museums. The Patton Museum at Fort Knox displayed a Sherman with original hedgerow prongs. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans later acquired a similar example, but most of the 2,850 devices were scrapped or lost. The engineering principles survived. Modern combat engineers study the Culin device as a case study in rapid field adaptation. The concept of using enemy obstacles as raw materials for friendly innovations appears in current military training. Army engineers in Iraq and Afghanistan applied similar thinking when developing counter-IED equipment. Curtis Culin died on November 20, 1963, in Greenwich Village, Manhattan. He was 48 years old. The obituary and local papers mentioned his Legion of Merit and his role in developing the hedgerow cutter. But the notice was brief. Few people outside military history remembered the innovation or its significance. 1 year later, something unexpected happened. President Dwight Eisenhower gave a television interview to CBS correspondent Walter Cronkite on the 20th anniversary of D-Day. Cronkite asked about the bocage problem. Eisenhower told the story of the hedgerow cutter. He described Culin by name. He explained how the device changed the campaign. The interview aired on June 6, 1964. Millions of Americans watched. Eisenhower's endorsement, delivered on national television by a former Supreme Allied commander, transformed the hedgerow cutter from footnote to legend. Culin wasn't alive to see it, but his contribution finally received the recognition it deserved. The interview footage was filmed in actual Normandy hedgerow country. Eisenhower stood in a field near St. Lo, showing Cronkite where the original demonstration occurred. The hedgerows were still there. 20 years later, still 12 feet high, still formidable obstacles. And Eisenhower explained how one sergeant from New Jersey solved a problem that baffled an entire army. The official recognition began before Operation Cobra finished. On July 28, 1944, 1st Army Headquarters issued Technical Bulletin TB-ORD 231. The bulletin officially designated the device as Hedgerow Cutting Device M1 Culin type. It included installation specifications, tactical employment guidelines, and maintenance procedures. The designation meant the improvised modification had become standard Army equipment. Supply depots stocked replacement prongs. Maintenance units carried welding specifications. Training manuals incorporated breach techniques. A field invention created in 3 days had entered official military doctrine in 3 weeks. 3rd Army adopted the device when it became operational on August 1st. General George Patton's forces received approximately 500 cutters for their advance across France. Patton's after-action reports credited the devices with enabling rapid movement through scattered bocage terrain in Brittany and eastern France. Ninth Army received technical specifications in September when it deployed to Europe. They manufactured approximately 200 devices using salvaged German steel from fortifications. The production happened at forward depots rather than Normandy beaches, proving the concept could be replicated anywhere steel and welding equipment existed. The British 21st Army Group formally requested American technical assistance on August 5th. British engineers visited the Columbier's production site and studied the design. They created their own variant called the Prong Device Mark I. Canadian forces developed similar equipment designated Obstacle Cutter Improvised Type A. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force issued a commendation for innovative field engineering on August 15th. The commendation cited the hedgerow cutter as an example of enlisted initiative solving operational problems. SHAEF distributed the citation to all Allied armies in Europe. It emphasized that tactical solutions could originate from any rank. The statistical analysis completed in September quantified the impact. First Army's Operational Research section compared casualty rates before and after Rhino deployment. Tank losses dropped from 8.3% per engagement to 4.7%. Crew casualties decreased 37%. Time required to advance through bocage terrain decreased by 73%. The economic calculation was equally significant. Each destroyed Sherman cost approximately $63,000 in 1944 currency. Each hedgerow cutter cost approximately $40 in scrap steel and 12 man-hours of labor. The devices saved an estimated 300 tanks during Cobra. That represented $18.9 million in preserved equipment, not counting the value of trained crews. The Armored Force Board at Fort Knox reviewed the device in October 1944. Their report recommended incorporating hedgerow breach training into basic tank crew qualification. The recommendation was implemented in November. Every American tank crew trained after that date learned Culin's techniques. Field Manual FM 1733, the Armored Battalion, received an update in December 1944. The update included a full chapter on obstacle breaching using improvised cutting devices. Diagrams showed proper prong installation. Tactical sections explained breach procedures. Maintenance sections covered field repairs. The doctrine spread beyond armored forces. Combat engineer training incorporated the concept of using enemy obstacles as raw materials. Infantry officers learned to identify suitable breach points for supporting armor. Artillery forward observers studied how to coordinate fires during hedgerow breaching operations. The long-term effect extended into Cold War doctrine. NATO forces, developing plans for potential combat in Central Europe, studied the bocage campaign extensively. Warsaw Pact defensive doctrine anticipated NATO forces using similar improvised breaching equipment. Soviet military publications from the 1950s referenced the Culin device as an example of capitalist military flexibility. The U.S. Army's Combat Studies Institute used the hedgerow cutter as a teaching case from 1953 onward. Officer candidates at West Point analyzed the decision-making process that led to the device's adoption. Enlisted leadership courses taught that tactical problems could be solved at any rank with proper initiative. By 1960, the hedgerow cutter appeared in 16 different military training curricula across NATO armies. The total number of soldiers who studied the innovation exceeded 50,000. The concept that one sergeant's sketch could change a campaign became institutionalized military knowledge. But Curtis Culin never taught those classes, never gave those lectures, never saw the doctrine manuals that bore his name. He worked at Schenley Industries, lived quietly in New York, and died in 1963, 18 months before Eisenhower's television interview made him a household name. The question became whether his contribution would be remembered beyond military circles or fade into the obscurity that claims most wartime innovations. The modern legacy of Curtis Culin's invention exists in three places: museum exhibits, military doctrine, and the memories of veterans who survived because of 4 steel prongs welded to tank bows. The Patton Museum at Fort Knox, Kentucky, displays an M4 Sherman with original Culin-type hedgerow cutters. The placard explains the bocage problem and how a sergeant from New Jersey solved it with German beach obstacle steel. Approximately 30,000 visitors see the exhibit annually. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans acquired a similar Sherman in 2007. Their exhibit includes photographs of the production line at Columbiers and copies of Bradley's original orders for mass production. Interactive displays let visitors understand the engineering principles behind the prongs. The Musée du Débarquement in Normandy has a small section dedicated to American field innovations. They display actual hedgerow cutter prongs recovered from abandoned tanks near St. Lo. French visitors often don't recognize their significance. American veterans do. But the most important legacy isn't in museums, it's in doctrine. Every modern military force teaches the principle Culin demonstrated. Strategic problems can be solved with available materials, tactical initiative, and 15 seconds of courage. That lesson influenced equipment development, training protocols, and command philosophy for 80 years. The hedgerow cutter principle appeared in Iraq, when soldiers welded scrap metal to Humvees for improvised armor protection. It appeared in Afghanistan, when engineers modified mine-resistant vehicles using field-fabricated parts. It appears whenever soldiers face unexpected tactical problems and create solutions without waiting for official equipment. Curtis Culin's grave is in New Jersey. The headstone mentions his military service and his Legion of Merit. It doesn't mention the hedgerow cutter. Most people walking through that cemetery don't know who he was or what he did. But 1,500 men came home from Normandy because of his invention. Those men had children. Those children had children. The number of people alive today because Curtis Culin welded beach trash to a tank in July 1944 is incalculable. Thousands. Maybe tens of thousands. He never knew that. He died thinking his contribution was a footnote. He worked a regular job, lived a quiet life, never sought recognition, never wrote memoirs, never gave interviews. Just a sergeant from Cranford who saw a problem and fixed it. The last surviving member of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron died in 2019. His obituary mentions serving alongside Curtis Culin. The veteran remembered watching the first hedgerow breach. He said it was the moment he knew they'd survive Normandy. That's the real legacy. Not the medals, not the museum displays, not the doctrine manuals. The legacy is measured in lives. 1,500 men who didn't burn to death in Sherman tanks. 1,500 families who got their sons and husbands and fathers back. And it started with a sergeant staring at scrap steel on a Norman beach, imagining what those German obstacles could become if you welded them to American tanks. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every week. Stories about sergeants and mechanics and ordinary soldiers who saved lives with scrap steel and courage and 15 seconds of genius. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from Texas, Germany, Australia, Japan? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Curtis Culin doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.